Roland Barthes was a writer who constantly reinvented himself or changed his style of writing in his literary career. So he was very creative, and initially he was highly influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre, but later uh, he actually created sensation, or he became kind of notorious by entering into a debate with a Sorbonne professor who wrote a book on Racine, and Barthes also wrote a book on Racine, and Barthes challenged the traditional kind of literary criticism. Barthes loosely belonged to a group of critics who were called their tradition of criticism was called La Nouvelle Critique, or New Criticism. Now, this New Criticism should not be confused with the New Criticism of the American school, uh, Anglo-American school, Emerson and others, William Emerson and others. This is a different French school of New Criticism. Then Barthes went on to become influenced by structuralism, and we may say that he has a structuralist phase of writing when he writes on narratology, where he is more influenced by linguistics, and then the next phase is a postmodernist phase, or post-structuralist, we may say post-structuralist and postmodernist phase, and he no longer follows the structuralist canon and the linguistic basis of the structuralist canon, and then goes beyond that, following post-structuralism, in which Derrida was also comrade or fellow who simultaneously developed the post-structuralist way of writing. And finally, he may be called a postmodernist in the sense of postmodernism, which has to be explained. What is postmodernism? We will do that later after reading the essay, because that is the last question that we will deal with, the postmodernist features of Roland Barthes, if any, to be found in this essay. So for the present, we just remember this chronology and the different developments, and towards the end of his career, he became more and more interested in exotic locales and exotic things like Japanese culture. He wrote a book called The Empire of Science, in which he spoke about Japanese culture. In the middle of his career, he wrote a number of essays, particularly the collection Mythologies, where he writes about the significance of not only words but also images, or anything for that matter, as sign, as leading to some other meaning, and which he called a new kind of mythology. In his book Mythology, there is an essay on myth. So this part of his career was what we call based on the knowledge of semiology or semiotics. Now I will explain this. All these new theories were possible because of the development in linguistics by the Swiss linguist Saussure. I'm writing his name. Saussure, in his essay on science, gave us the concept, Ferdinand de Saussure, Nature of the Linguistic Sign, gave us the concept that a sign has two aspects, signifier and signified. So if we take a word to be a sign, which means something, so it is a sign of something. So it has two aspects, signifier and signified. What is the signifier? The written word on the page made the markings with black ink, that is the signifier, but the word can also be spoken, and therefore the sounds which we can hear, so that acoustic image. So both the visible image and the acoustic image of a word, that is the signifier, and what we understand by that word, which we call meaning, that he said is the signifier. So a sign has two aspects. He suggested that there are many words which are mostly similar, apart from, say, the difference of one letter or one sound. So let us compare the words cat and bat, for example. So linguistically we will see that caw is replaced by baw, the sound in the second word, and there is no other difference, but the difference of one letter makes a difference in the meaning. So he suggested that in this way, phonologically we can understand that meaning is produced by difference. So which later we know that Derrida will make much of difference by bringing his theory of difference. We will go to that later. Now here we are discussing the elementary ideas of Saussure. Now he says that meaning is arbitrary. Meaning in language is arbitrary. There is no logic behind it. So why caw and at sound would mean a particular animal, and baw and at bat sound will mean another different animal? The association between the signifier and the signified, there is no logic behind that. It is arbitrary. So that is another rule of Saussure, that language is arbitrary. Now you can of course see that behind this also there is an influence of Nietzschean philosophy, who assume that everything is arbitrary in this world. And if in language also we see no rationality at work, then it becomes some kind of linguistic nihilism. But let us leave that for the moment. And so what Saussure produced, or the way he looked at language, is basically that he spoke language as a string of signs. And the next most important idea that he presented is that the sign which has a particular signified, a particular content or a particular meaning, that meaning is never the same. That meaning changes with every use in every context. And therefore language may be rather called a chain of signifiers, where meanings keep constantly changing. So this and then this change of meaning of language can be examined both historically or chronologically. That is how through the ages particular words change their meanings or change their usage, or it can be examined in a particular time, how in different languages a particular sound has different meanings. So the first approach, which is vertical approach, that is chronological approach, we may say it is a diachronic approach in linguistic terms, through the ages, that is the old type of linguistics, which is called philology, which was very popular in the 19th century, particularly among Germans. So philology is a diachronic study of language, and the new kind of linguistics that does not study language through time, through the axis of time, but through the axis of space, and that is called synchronic study of language. So these may be represented in a graph. So if we draw a vertical line, that represents the diachronic, and which we may cross with a horizontal line like in a graph, and that will represent the synchronic, that is study of language at a particular point of time in different spaces. Therefore, behind Saussure's theory, his principle that in language meaning is produced by difference, and language is arbitrary, that is signifier and signified, there is no logical relationship, it is arbitrary. So this led to a science of signs which is called semiology or semiotics. So whereas linguistics looks only at language as a system of science, one can see many other subjects as system of science. For example, images. So if we study images, icons, paintings, and then we try to understand the meaning of those images, how they have different signifiers. So that is another kind of study of science. Or if we study different cultures and we take cultural rites or social practices as signifiers of some social cultural meaning or social cultural ideology, then that would be a study of science in a different domain. So Lévi-Strauss applied semiology on Claude Lévi-Strauss applied semiology on anthropology, on the study of different tribes and their culture, and wrote a book called Structural Anthropology. So as more and more these linguistic concepts began to be applied on other domains of knowledge, there rose the theory of structuralism, which examines everything from diachronic and synchronic paradigms, makes paradigmatic study of any domain of knowledge. And this structuralism can be used in understanding literature, and there rose the schools of structuralist interpretation of literature. So basically it depended or it derived from Saussurean linguistics. And then post-structuralism. So structuralism looks at structures instead of at preconceived ideological significance. It looks at structures, it attempts to study every domain of knowledge as Saussure studies language. Others attempt this insight or this method of study to their particular domains, and therefore they study structurally. But they still believe that the structural study of any subject, any science, would ultimately lead to a particular interpretation or would arrive at a particular meaning. But post-structuralism and finally postmodernism went one step beyond this. So a philosopher like Derrida grasped the idea of Saussurean idea that meaning is deferred because in language signified changes from one context to another, and what is signifier becomes in a later context a signified, and then the signified becomes in the next stage a signifier, and in this way the chain of signification moves where no signifier stands for a permanent signified, because according to usage, according to context, the signified keeps changing. Therefore Saussure spoke of a deferral of meaning, and Derrida grasped that and said in his famous coinage of the word différence in French, now there will be an acute accent on E, acute accent meaning an accent leaning from left to right, différence. So this word in French means two things. One is difference, and two, deferral. So at the same time, two ideas that signifier, a signifier never has a permanent meaning, but its signified is deferred. This idea, as well as its immediate signified, immediate meaning, is produced by difference or difference. So these two ideas are simultaneously presented by Derrida's coinage of this word différence, which meant both deference and deferral. So we may say that this point of view suggests that there is no ultimate meaning of anything, because meaning or signified is very slippery. It constantly changes from hand to hand, from author to author, from usage to usage. Therefore, it leads to a worldview that perfectly suits our modern times, that we do not have, our world does not have any permanent meaning. And when this idea is narrowed to the level of a text, then a text does not have any final meaning. That becomes the basic idea. And Derrida's deconstruction theory explains then you are faced with another neology, another new word coined by Derrida, deconstruction. So what does it mean? So an author has constructed a text. Now according to Derrida, the reader's task is to deconstruct that text. So the difference between destruction and deconstruction is that the reader destroys the meaning, destroys the author's meaning, and constructs a meaning of his own. And therefore, Derrida coins this word deconstruction. So, I write something, you destroy my meaning, and you create a meaning of your own. So, you deconstruct my speech, or you deconstruct my writing. So, you can see that these are all developments from this socioreal linguistics, but Derrida and later Barthes, they move beyond structuralism and speak more and more of the permanently indefinite nature of meaning, and therefore we may say that a kind of skeptical attitude is expressed through their writings. So we may say that this skepticism which began in the Renaissance with Michel de Montaigne, that becomes victorious in the new avatar of Derrida and Barthes, the later French, successors of Montaigne and others. All right. So yes. So I was trying to explain semiology and semantics. Semiology is a science of signs, which means that not only linguistics, but we may have science, and Barthes applies this to popular culture. So in mythologies, in the book Mythologies, he has essays like The Face of Greta Garbo. So what is the face of Greta Garbo? It is an image. It is an image taken from popular culture, and what meaning does it have for people at large? So a semantic understanding or a semantic interpretation of an image, or which Barthes would say a new myth, a myth of the modern times. So the face of an icon of heroine in films, of a popular heroine or something like that, Marilyn Monroe. It has a lot of charm, a lot of romance, a lot of ideas which are not interpreted, but a lot of emotion and passion go with that idea. So this is a new kind of myth. Or say Barthes has an essay on Citroën, a modern French car. So according to Barthes, that is another myth, a new myth created by French nation, by the French nation, by French industry, and so on. So this kind of attempt to decipher things which are not only words, but still they are signs of something. They are signs of a particular culture, a particular fashion, a particular trend. The Eiffel Tower, Barthes has an essay on the Eiffel Tower in that book. So the Eiffel Tower is not only a tower, it stands for French national pride, pride in technological glory of French engineers, and also its aesthetics, its artistic beauty, and its meaning for different people in different realms of life. So it has become an icon or a new myth, according to Barthes. So this kind of application of the science of sign to other things than language, this is called semiology. Semantics is the same thing. Semiology has a Latin origin. Semantics is Greek. Now you will tell me that the word logos is Greek, so why should semiology be of Latin origin? Unfortunately, the Latins have nothing of their own. They have taken everything from the Greeks, so they have taken the word logos from the Greeks and naturalized it into Latin. So in French you will see a lot of words ending with logy, L-O-G-Y. So it has been Latinized, all right. And whereas in those nations who follow the Greek language more, like Bulgarians, Now you will ask me why suddenly Bulgarian? Because Julia Kristeva, Tristan Todorov, these great critics, they are Bulgarians. So East Europeans, they follow the Greek language more closely. So Kristeva writes a book named Semiotike. She writes it in this way, Semiotike with K. So the English people would use C, semiotics. In Greek it will be K. So Kristeva would follow the Greek fashion. Okay, so semiotics and semiology are the same. So I am following this book, Modern Criticism and Theory, edited by David Lodge. If you do not have this book, you should collect one. It is a very good book, a compilation of many essays, but I doubt whether it is still available in the market or not. Its counterpart is 20th century literary criticism, which has a similar cover, which has critical essays up to the 20th century, essays which belong to the traditional criticism, and this volume has essays which belong to modern theory. So let us begin the essay, The Death of the Author. It is a reminder of the Mort d'Arthur by Malory, the death of Arthur, but here it is the death of the author. Right. Barthes begins dramatically by referring to Balzac's story Sarrazin. Sarrazin is a novella or a long story. So if you read writers like Barthes, Derrida, or these modern writers, French writers, you will see that they would mostly refer to French literature. So you will be in unfamiliar domain. You will have to familiarize yourself with French literature in order to read Barthes or Derrida or any other modern French writer. So they won't refer to Anglo-American tradition. Why should they? Because French literature is very rich. Okay. So in his story Sarrazin, Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence: "This was a woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility." Now, one thing that you will notice in Barthes' essay is that it uses a lot of text by other writers, which in modern terms is called intertextuality. So intertextuality does not mean that only that you quote from other writers, but it means that you internalize other writers and weave their thoughts into your writing. Barthes himself was a propounder of intertextuality, along with Kristeva, I think, Julia Kristeva. So today we are using the word intertextuality. It is a new modern critical term which was popularized by Barthes and Kristeva. So this story of Sarrazin, where we find this comment about woman, then this comment is uncertain. I mean, the speaker is uncertain. And Barthes says, who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story, bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato, hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac the individual, furnished by his personal experience with the philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac the author, professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology? We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. Now this is very revolutionary if we think of traditional writers like Raymond Picard, with whom Raymond Picard, I am writing the name, Raymond Picard, with whom Barthes fought over his interpretation of Racine. Now, Picard was a great scholar, a famous professor of Sorbonne. And as you know that academic people, they are always, they love to fight, and they always try to dominate over particular areas, to some extent like street dogs. Academics are very similar to street dogs. They love to dominate their areas, and they do not want others to allow others in their domains. So Picard was fighting with Barthes over the interpretation of Racine. Picard himself wrote a book on Racine. Barthes was a new teacher, we may say, like in today's terms, an assistant professor or a lecturer who has only recently got a job. And Picard was an established professor. So you know how professors hate lecturers. And a lecturer challenging a professor by suggesting that his interpretation is totally wrong. So Picard could not take this. So he ensured that Barthes would never get a job in Sorbonne. All right. So Barthes finally found a job in some other college de France. Okay, so this kind of writing that Barthes writes here, he speaks of, he says that in writing our subject slips away. It is a neutral point, a neutral space, and writing is the lack of voice. So a voice metaphysically stands for presence. Therefore, writing stands for absence of any metaphysical authority. Why I am saying this? Because the whole idea of the author has a metaphysical basis. So if we think of Flaubert's notion that an author in his novel is like God, a creator who is present everywhere but nowhere to be seen. I taught PG1, a portrait of the artist, I just finished. So there I had to speak of this. I taught you also, I think. So you will remember that Flaubert said that an author is like God the creator. In his novel, he is omnipresent, he is all-pervasive, but he is nowhere to be seen. So he is a metaphysical presence. And an author gets his authority from his presence. But the moment he writes something, then writing is without voice. So writing is without his presence. And it is at the mercy of the reader, how the reader would interpret the writing. If the author were present and the reader interpreted his writing in a wrong way or in a different way, then the author could fight with him, could call names or give him a few blows. But that is not possible in the case of writing. So writing is neutral. The author is nowhere in sight. Therefore, it can be given any interpretation, and in spite of copyright or whatever, the author has very little control once he has written something over his piece of writing. Okay, so Barthes says that it is the negative where all identity is lost, and it is a kind of body writing, that is writing is itself here a kind of principle of signification. Okay, so let us once again come back to this story. Now, this will not be completely intelligible unless you know the story of Sarrazin. So you may look at Wikipedia, just type Sarrazin, and then you will get the summary of the story. It is a very interesting story where Sarrazin falls in love. Sarrazin is a sculptor. Now he goes to Italy. He is a French sculptor. He goes to Italy and there sees castrato. Castrato, you know, were boys who were castrated in those times, who were castrated so that their voice did not change. So the boys usually have very shrill voice like women, but as they grow up their voice changes into masculine voice, and we know that boys sing in choirs. As long as they are very young and their voice does not break, they can sing in choir groups. In Italy, the boys were castrated so that their voice won't change and they could continue singing in operas. They were called castrato. Now, therefore, such boys or such men, they would often dress as women in operas and play the role of women, like boy actors in Elizabethan stage. So because their voice was not masculine, so they played the role of women. So this is a practice that only the Italians were familiar with. Sarrazin being French, nobody even told him about this practice. So he saw a beautiful singer named Zambinella and immediately fell in love with her, believing her to be a woman. And then somebody told him, the Duke or whoever, a character tells him that Zambinella is not a woman, but castrato, but a man. But Sarrazin does not believe him and forcefully brings her home. And then Zambinella, he had made a statue of the beautiful woman Zambinella, believing her to be a woman. Then when he brought her home, then Zambinella confesses that she is actually a castrato, she is a man. And at that moment, the cardinal who employed the castrato Zambinella, the Italian cardinal, he sends a group of assassins who come and stab and kill Sarrazin. Balzac's story begins in this way, that in a party in the palace of Lanty, Monsieur Lanty, there a gentleman went to visit, was invited in that party, and his girlfriend was also there, and beside his girlfriend an old man was sitting, and the girlfriend became interested in that old man, and he was kind of very secretive character, and there seemed to be a lot of mystery about that old man. And when the man with his girlfriend comes home, then the man tells him, the narrator tells her that old man was Zambinella. And then he tells her the whole story of Zambinella. So Zambinella, the castrato, the great singer who appeared as a beautiful woman to Sarrazin, and how Sarrazin was killed by the cardinal because Sarrazin was trying to force Zambinella, all that story. And then Barth comments that Barth says that Sarrazin would not have been murdered if he could properly interpret his text. So in this case the text is Zambinella, who apparently appears to be a woman but is actually a man. And in order to interpret this text, one must know the context. So Sarrazin did not know the Italian context, that in Italian culture the castrato, they sing songs in the garb of women. Okay, so it was a case of a classic mistake in interpretation. So here Barthes quotes from Balzac and says that who is the speaker of this voice. So in this story, the idea of womanhood has been problematized. What is the essence of a woman? As Zambinella appeared to Sarrazin, she appeared to be the most beautiful woman in his eyes. Therefore, there is something very slippery about the identity of woman or the definition of womanhood. So read again this line. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Now these are the definitions or features of a woman. But who is the definer? Who has defined a woman? And Balzac keeps this indeterminate in his story. So there is no speaker. It may not be the author. So we can at most say that it is the authorial voice. But that will be our interpretation. That may not be the case. So therefore it is the crux of interpretation or the crux of reading, that reading is always ambiguous, multivalent, there can always be multiple interpretations, and there is always some mystery about reading, and there is always also a possibility of loss of meaning and a transfiguration of meaning. Therefore, this whole issue that Barthes brings up at the beginning of the story, the beginning of his essay, it is an issue not only about interpretation but also about authority. Who is the author? Who is the speaker? Therefore, our conventional notion that the author who writes something, he has the sole prerogative, some kind of a metaphysical authority over his writing, that whole issue is problematized when we look at a text in this fashion, that a text has many folds that need to be unfolded. Only when you unfold, then you see something that is inside. A text is always metaphorically compared to a fabric with its warp and woof. So the texture of its weaving, okay, which means that a text contains within itself multiplicity, not just one thing. So who is the speaker? Is it Balzac the individual who has a philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac the author who has literary ideas on femininity? Literary within single inverted commas, meaning that literary ideas are not necessarily real ideas, or they may not be true. So whatever is literary is suspect. Okay. Is it universal wisdom? If there is any such thing as universal wisdom, romantic psychology is basically an aberration. So what is romantic cannot be classic. So classically it is false. So romantic psychology is a kind of aberration. We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. So this is a philosophical, or we may say metaphysical concept, the concept of origin. So whenever we try to look at the origin of something, then we are looking at that thing metaphysically. What is the origin of this world? we then assume that there is a presence behind this world who is responsible for its generation or creation. So we are taking a metaphysical approach towards interpretation when we are raising a question of origin. Similarly, if we apply this question of origin to the level of writing or literature, who is the author of a piece of writing? So if we imagine that the person who writes a piece of writing is the author or the origin, then we imagine him to be like God. So the idea of author is a theology of writing, when you believe that the author is all powerful like God. So you are believing in a metaphysics of presence. But are we doing the right thing if we are looking at or trying to look at a metaphysics of presence behind writing? Because does not writing essentially mean that there is no presence? There is no voice. So writing means that voice has been destroyed there. There is no voice. There are only marks left. So this attitude of trying to interpret a text in this manner by the meaning that the author gives it, it is a metaphysical way of looking at things. Therefore, Barth says that writing is the neutral. The neutral is a very important concept in Barth. Later he will write a whole book called The Neutral. The neutral. So even if we think of gender, as we all know today that gender has been highly problematized. There are no longer any binaries. So there also we have to think of the neutral. The neutral means that the active agency is taken away, and writing is neutral, composite, oblique space. Composite, different agents are at work. Oblique means not direct. So it can be refracted in various ways by various readers. Writing is refracted in the psyche of various readers. So this is a space which is neutral, composite, oblique, where our subject slips away. So who can be the subject of a piece of writing? Subject in the sense agent, one who writes. The negative, where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. So the body writing, that is the author, if we imagine the author physically with a body, who is holding a pen in his hand writing, that idea of the body writing, that dissolves when we see only at the marks on the page. Then we do not see the body anymore. So the author dissolves, vanishes. So I am holding a book in my hands. Do I see any author here? No. I see only marks on the page. That is the difference between voice and writing, or presence and absence of metaphysical presence. And that is why Plato was against writing. Plato expressed his reservation against writing. Most Greek philosophers objected against writing because of a mnemonic reason. That is, writing leads to loss of memory. Before the culture of writing arrived, there was the oral culture. When everything was taught orally, remembered and reproduced from memory. But when writing arrived, it destroyed memory. Earlier people would remember whole epic poems by heart and could recite them out of memory. No doubt it always has always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally, outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin, the author enters into his own death, writing begins. As soon as a fact is narrated, so composing a narration means writing it down. So narration means that you are not going to act, you are only reporting something. So here we see the metaphysical distinction between agency and lack of agency. So there is a disconnection with the source, with the origin, and therefore the moment something is narrated or written down, the author dies. So this essay is about the death of the author. I can conclude the essay here because Barthes has said everything that he wanted to say in these few lines. So we may or may not read the rest because the author has already died. Okay, so we have come to the end of the plot. The author enters into his own death, writing begins. So the assumption of this essay is that writing only begins after the author dies. Because as long as the author is there, his metaphysical presence is there, he has any authority over his writing. But once he has narrated it or written it, he dies. He dies in a metaphysical sense. That is, he loses all control over his narration, over his writing. And then writing begins. And what is writing? We will see that much of writing is created by the reader, which has been explained at much greater length by Sartre in What is Writing. Okay, that I have already taught you. So you will be able to understand this piece very easily. So you will see the influence of Sartre on Barthes here. The sense of this phenomenon, however, has varied. In ethnographic societies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person but by a mediator, shaman or relator whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired but never his genius. So if we look at tribes anthropologically, or like anthropologists, we look at primitive tribes and try to understand how human beings originally operated, then we see that the narration was rendered by a shaman or a priest, and it was never assumed by a person but by a mediator. So the shaman or the priest represented himself or presented himself as a mediator between the audience and the spirit or the ghost. So the ghost or the spirit enters into his body and the shaman goes into a trance and then he performs. He dances, he falls down, he gets up. So all this performance is narration, and he is only a mediator. So the shaman does not take upon himself the authority, even though he is narrating. So this idea of the genius, the writer is a genius who writes something of his own, this foolish idea was a product of Romanticism. The idea of genius, Shakespeare is a genius, or for that matter any romantic poet is a genius. The idea of genius was produced by the romantics, the notion that anything can be created by somebody on his own. Now primitive people did not believe it. So when they recited a poetry or narrated something, even then they assumed that some spirit is speaking through him. Like the Plato's theory of enthusiasm, inspiration, God enters into the poet, and through furor poeticus, poetic madness, in a state of trance, beware, beware, in Coleridge's poetry. So Kubla Khan. So in a state of trance, the poet says something. So what the poet says is like a prophet. It comes from God. So in primitive societies, people never had this vanity to claim that he originated something.